Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI Radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is John Carter. John is a lifelong advocate for restoring wildlife corridors and core wild areas for deer, elk, lynx, wolverine, grizzly bear. John is a professional ecologist and founder of the organization called Yellowstone to Uintas, Y2U, which is dedicated to restoring the regional wildlife corridor connecting the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem to the Northern and Southern Rockies. He is also the board president for the Kiesha Preserve, a 1,000-acre wildlife preserve and research area in Idaho and Wyoming. John is the author of numerous publications and presentations on wilderness and wildlife based on the best available science. He lives in Bondurant, Wyoming. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm looking forward to this.
Would you like to make some introductory comments?
Yes, it's hard to know where to start. You mentioned the Yellowstone to Uintas connection and Kiesha's Preserve. And in recent weeks, you've interviewed a number of my close friends, George Worthner, Kirk Robinson, Jonathan Ratner. And as I mull over where we are as a society today and how we address these issues, I began to think back, well, why do I care? What generates a Jonathan Ratner, a George Worthner, a Kirk Robinson? And I reflected back as I was reading Wallace Stegner's Wolf Willow book as he recounted his early boyhood in southern Saskatchewan, living a pioneer lifestyle. And I was fortunate enough to basically live my younger years from the time I could barely walk until I went to college on my grandfather's farm. And in that period of time, I was educated by him and all of his stories of his bear hunts and his coon hunts. And he would take me out hunting, fishing, and we'd explore through the woods, and he taught me how to track and trail wildlife and observe nature. And so that and the farm experience where we actually lived a pioneering lifestyle. I was born right before World War II started, so I'm 84 years old. And we lived with rationing and a very simple life. We raised all of our food. We had all the farm animals, the horses, the cattle, the pigs, the chickens, the turkeys. And so living a simple life and a self-sustaining life stuck with me through all of my career as an engineer, designing and building commercial and industrial developments in the South, and to later as training as an ecologist and moving to Utah and learning more about the West, which I've been discovering since my folks moved there in the late 50s. And so I keep that thread, no matter whether I was doing engineering in Atlanta, I would always escape to go fishing in the Chattahoochee River or head up to the Smokies to backpack and fish up there. I was always returning to the farm. And so no matter how disconnected I was from those places, they stayed with me. And even today, after I got my ecology degree, I worked for industry, the oil and gas, oil shale industries, hydroelectric industries, collecting data, using that data to get permits, address environmental issues, cleaning up Superfund sites, actually trying to quantify nature in many ways. And later on, as I began to try to hunt and fish around my home in Logan, Utah, actually Minden, I encountered the degradation of our forests from clear cutting, livestock grazing, and I began to collect data there, and I would take that data to the Forest Service, and I was told, you don't know the difference between use and abuse. And here I was, a professional consultant with a PhD in ecology, and I wasn't qualified to know what damage looked like to an environment I'd been studying for decades, and it's like that started me down this road to setting up nonprofits to engage with the agencies like the Forest Service and BLM to confront them with science and facts and information and options. And you essentially meet a dead end, a blank wall. And so I really had to start setting up nonprofits so that we could try to litigate these decisions, continue making comments, confronting them with the data to try to get change. And so that has led to where we are today. The Kiesha Preserve story, basically, I started collecting the land for Kiesha Preserve in the early 90s, and it became kind of my Walden. I would go up there with my Akitas and camp and hike around and look at the sage steppe and the streams and just get close to nature. I spent nearly every day hiking out around and looking at nature. And so that deeper understanding you get having the ecology degree as well as the on-ground experience like a naturalist has really stood me in good stead, but it doesn't alleviate my concern over where we are with the natural world and where society is. And so reflecting back to my childhood experience, it motivated me and Jason and Candace, his wife, my foster son and his wife, who manage Kiesha Preserve, and also they manage YDU, to begin doing an education program for youth. And so we have on Kiesha Preserve a nature trail where we take groups and acquaint them with various features, everything from beavers to harvester ants to watersheds. And we also have a facility in Paris, Idaho that was a farm store that we've turned into an education center to educate people on gardening and food preservation, because that goes back to my time as a child on the farm where we raised and preserved all of our food. Almost nothing came from the store. You couldn't just go down to the convenience store or the grocery store and pick up something to eat. You had to think ahead and be prepared and be self-sufficient. And so, anyway, having Kiesha Preserve, I moved up there in 2010, 2011 time period, and immediately learned that a 2,500-acre phosphate mine was going to be permitted adjacent to the preserve. Well, here I was, 2 decades into trying to protect this wildlife habitat, and here comes a phosphate mine. And so that got me interested in the phosphate mining industry and the habitat alterations in southeast Idaho that have come about as a result of that. And it led me back to the nonprofit world and setting up the Yellowstone to Uintas connection to begin working to preserve what the Forest Service had identified as a wildlife corridor, a regionally significant wildlife corridor that connected the Yellowstone area to the Uinta Mountains, as well as the Yellowstone area to the Northern Rockies. And so I became dedicated to bringing attention to this corridor, which travels from Yellowstone through the Wyoming Range in western Wyoming, down through the Caribou Range and other mountain ranges in southeast Idaho, the Bear River Range, and then the Wasatch Mountains into the Uinta Wilderness in northern Utah and Wyoming. And so the effort since that time has been to address Forest Service projects particularly that occur in that wildlife corridor that we then named the Yellowstone to Uintas connection as that segment from Yellowstone to the Uintas. And so that's where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. And that actually already answers my first question. So let me go to the second one. what is the Western Wildway, and how is it related to the Y2U connection?
Well, the Wildlands Network, the Wildlands Project, this is a conservation biology approach that evolved in the early 90s, and it had to do with connecting habitats for wide-ranging species and others, and providing connections between core areas and other areas further north and south. And so it basically, the Western Wildway is a corridor that extends from Alaska and the Yukon down through the Rocky Mountains into Mexico. And so it's most of your high elevation areas, but also the connecting areas that wildlife might use to migrate between those, perhaps we might call them islands of habitat that would be suitable for a thing like a wolverine or a Canada lynx or a grizzly bear. Mm-hmm. And so the Western Wildway was this vision of people like Michael Soule and others. George Werthner has done a lot of work describing these areas in the 90s that were at risk. And I have most of those descriptions in a file I keep here in my computer. And he was prescient and where things were going to be threatened, like developments that would occur north of Yellowstone and this sort of thing. And so trying to preserve habitat and then provide a way for these wide-ranging species to move between those habitats is our concern. And the idea of protecting a species like Canada lynx, for example, is that it's a wide-ranging species. It requires a wide area, many square kilometers of habitat for a home range, but it can wander widely. But they have focused in high elevation, snow-covered areas, and trying to protect the Canada lynx and its habitats as well as its connections. Then, if you can protect and restore that habitat, you're also protecting and restoring habitat for many other species like grizzly bears, wolverines, elk, many small animals and birds, that snowshoe hares, things like that the lynx depends upon, and the riparian areas that a snowshoe hare might forage in. Those kinds of things, all of the different habitats and the diversity would be protected if you can actually make it functional for a single species.
Mm-hmm. That's very clear. Thank you. So lynx were reintroduced in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado beginning in 1999. Have Colorado lynx showed up in Wyoming, and have any of them made it into the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem?
Yes. Where to start? As you know, I've done a lot of work on Canada lynx, and while I don't pretend to be an expert on the Canada lynx itself, as a professional ecologist and someone that's studied these systems for decades now, I've learned enough about this that it's clear what is happening with the situation with our agencies. But when they introduced lynx or reintroduced lynx in central Colorado and the San Juans and those areas, they put about 218 lynx in that period of time between 1999 and 2006. Now, of those, I think about 31 made it into Wyoming. Most of those went into the Medicine Bow Range, which is kind of south-central Wyoming, and then they turned around and came back. And what's interesting to me is if you look at a map of all of the collared lynx locations that's presented in the publications, you see like this shotgun pattern of observations. I mean, they were in Colorado, they were in Wyoming, they were in Idaho, they were in Montana, they were in maybe Nebraska. And so what became clear to me from the pattern was they brought these lynx from Alaska and Canada, and they had a short period of acclimatization in Colorado. Then they would be released. Well, it almost appears from the maps that, hey, guys, we're heading north. We're going back home. And so they all tried to go north to Canada, but the ones that went into the Medicine Bow Range encountered high desert beyond there, no really nearby connecting mountains. And so they would turn around and go back. A few persisted. More went through an area in northeastern Utah called the Uinta Mountains and Uinta Wilderness. And from there, they worked their way north up into the Wyoming Range and into the Greater Yellowstone. So of about 30 lynx that went into Wyoming, I believe 9 made it into the Greater Yellowstone area. The only ones that reproduced were a pair that reproduced in the Medicine Bow Mountains early on. And since that time, we've had a few observations. I mean, in 2005, one of the lynx researchers, John Squires, published a paper on a lynx migration path that actually goes through where I live here in Bondurant, Wyoming. And it's an area that it's like conifer forest, it's sagebrush, it's aspen, there's riparian areas, it's a diverse habitat. It doesn't really fit what their model would say. You know, I mean, while we have a lot of snow, and we had a lot of snow in the past, it's more of a diverse habitat than what one normally thinks of as lynx habitat. But my experience at our preserve with lynx's principal prey, which is snowshoe hares, is that these are the kind of habitats that snowshoe hares also inhabit and do well in. And so when we see agency documents that try to limit lynx to just a specific time of year, snow period, midwinter, mature forest, they can't live anywhere else. That's the story. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe that's actually true. And the research that I've done and the reviews I've done and the models I've analyzed tell me that they have a bit broader habitat tolerance or adaptation than just what they're biologically or physically adapted to, which is to operate in deep snow to pursue snowshoe hares. Of course, if that's the environment we could provide for them all the time, that would be ideal. But, you know, with climate change, snows are becoming less frequent and we're getting less snowpack. And so those habitats are becoming more marginalized as climate continues to heat. And so we need to be realistic about what habitats lynx can use and protect those habitats, not just these postage stamp areas that the Fish and Wildlife Service has tried to designate as critical habitat these days.
Okay. Well, you wrote a long management critique of federal agency plans for the Canada Lynx, and you released it in 2026, in which you show that none of the major players, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, have mapped or provided criteria for migration corridors for lynx. Why do you think they have failed to do this?
It's difficult to answer a question like that. You have to ask yourself, is it a narrow political interest in favor of extractive industries that would be harmed if you tried to protect Canada lynx habitat? Is it lack of knowledge? What is it about ecology? Don't they understand? Ecology is not black and white. There are things called ecotones. They're transitional areas. You might have sagebrush habitats transitioning into aspen, transitioning into conifer forest. And so they're not black and white demarcations. And the picture that is being painted by the agencies is one of a continually narrowing definition of the habitats that Canada lynx need. And of course, the more narrow you define those habitats, then the more land is open for extraction, logging, motorized recreation, mining, all of these extractive things that we do without actually mitigating the damage we do. And that's where I've had a big focus, is trying to convince the agencies that they need to describe these habitats and the science is clear. I mean, we have researchers that have been researching lynx habitat, snowshoe hare habitat for decades, and these studies were published in about the year 2000. We had great reports coming out that described the habitat needs of Canada lynx. They described the human impacts that affect those habitats and lynx. And yet, when it came down to implementing these recommendations in forest plans or land management plans for the BLM, essentially a management direction came out called the Northern Rockies Lynx Management Direction, which was a direction to the forests and the other public lands entities to set standards for protecting lynx habitat. Well, after all of the basic science that was available at the time showed that all of these human impacts adversely affected lynx because it adversely affected lynx habitat structure and function. Logging affected snowshoe hares. It destroyed habitat for them and therefore habitat for Canada lynx. Road densities, high road densities, exploding recreation, all of those things. And yet when the NRLMD came out, they published a remand notice, Fish and Wildlife Service had, that essentially said, well, we don't have enough evidence to show that these things impact Canada lynx. And so basically we're going to dismiss all of those, and we will address maybe forest stand structure through a few basic vegetation standards. But nothing in that really dealt with the actual structural and functional attributes of what lynx habitat should consist of as described by the scientists before and since. And so it's an example, I guess, of how we have diluted our knowledge and our regulatory environment to the detriment of not only the Canada lynx but to ourselves, because if we damage all of our watersheds with sediment loads and pollution from livestock and clear-cutting forests, and stream temperatures heat up because they're no longer shaded and the fish die, and our water supply is compromised because we've affected the hydrology. The springs and seeps have dried up, and so those no longer exist because we actually grazed the land so much that we lost the topsoil, and the water no longer could infiltrate in and replenish those springs. And so it's a whole web of relationships that leads back to us. I like to say nature doesn't depend on us. We depend on nature, and yet we pretend it's the reverse.
Okay, well, it is was a very difficult question. I think you've given some good answers. Now, you mentioned that sheep grazing in the high Uinta wilderness is degrading the habitat for Canada lynx. I'm sure that cows are also doing their fair share of harm as well. You also mentioned that even those lands and waters given the highest protection, such as designated wilderness areas and national parks, are not truly protected. What changes must be made in the Uinta wilderness to truly protect the lynx?
Well, your interview with Howie Wolk was touching on what is wilderness. And I remember one of his comments saying, you asked him, what happens to your wilderness experience if you come across a group of cows in the wilderness?
Yes.
And he basically said it destroys it. And so back in the 70s, I was a Sierra Club group chair in Logan, Utah, and the head of the Rocky Mountain Outings program for the Sierra Club. And so I led trips for teenagers into various wilderness areas like the Uintas, the Sierras, the Wind Rivers, the Deep Creek Mountains, places like that. And so as I went into the Uintas in the 70s, I noticed that, wow, these trails, they're like roads. And the system, while it's a beautiful place, there was a lot of bare soil and a lot of what looked like damage, but I couldn't put my finger on it. But I kept going back and climbing the peaks and hiking the ridges and finding that on these high elevation ridges, there was domestic sheep manure all over, and it was polluting the streams. And a friend of mine got giardia from drinking water from one of those streams. And of course, sheep carry giardia. But it was not until, I guess, the 1990s that I started going back to the Uintas with actually Kiesha, my Akita, who the Kiesha Preserve is named for. Her and her mate and daughter, Nikki, would carry my gear, and I would go into the Uintas and do surveys of vegetation, ground cover, documenting erosion, covering lots of areas off trail. And what you learned is that they have these dedicated, what do they call them, livestock trails, driveways. And so they'll take tens of thousands of sheep up one of these driveways to get to these upper basins. But they do this in early summer when there's still snow in these areas, and the ground is soft, and there's thousands of sheep trample the soil. They graze off the vegetation before it actually has had a chance to really get growing and replenish its root reserves. And so you end up with these watersheds with 50% bare ground, which if you compare that to ungrazed watersheds in the Uintas, which are 100% ground cover, you have one healthy watershed without sheep and one almost destroyed watershed with sheep. And so to a trained eye, it's really clear. But the Forest Service, the Uinta Wasatch Cache and Ashley National Forests, and their range staff can go into those areas and blame the damage from 30,000 sheep and say, well, it's the pocket gophers. And so I guess there must be a population of tens of millions of pocket gophers in the Uintas doing all that damage. But these are trained botanists and people, and so they work for an agency, and for whatever reason, cannot see the damage, and it's very fortunate for them. You know, it's like very easy. But they produce these voluminous monitoring reports where they monitor places where the sheep don't graze, or they explain it away. In one photo, they'll show a completely barren area, and on the other side, a wetland area. And the very person that says, well, this is a naturally barren area, is the same guy that at a public meeting would say, well, the sheep don't like to graze in wetland areas. And so he's like, okay, on the one hand, you've got the wetland area that looks okay, and to the left, we've got this barren area. Well, where do you think the sheep are going if they don't like to be in wetlands? Mm-hmm. They're over there where there's an upland area that they can graze the plants out of. And so they deflect around the damage and deceive the public, and it's a very unfortunate thing. And that's one of the things that has driven me all these years to continue confronting these agencies with data, with analysis, and with criticism and critiques like this Lynx report and like the one I just finished on the path of the pronghorn here in our Sublette County area in Wyoming, is to put this information out there to help others confront the agency and try to effect change at a local, site-specific area, one piece at a time, and that's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask you this. Do you think a wilderness organization in the spirit of people such as Aldo Leopold, Bob Marshall, David Breyer, that was not interested in compromising with industry and local interess, would such an organization resonate today as it did in the early days of wilderness advocacy?
That's a difficult question, and it touches on something that really concerns me, and that is the preoccupation in our society today with things that aren't necessary. Like I said, I reflected back on my life on the farm and how we lived in the very basic, providing food and shelter, and there weren't amenities. And I still think today that was the best of all possible periods in my life. Living in cities didn't bring satisfaction. I always fled from cities. And so getting a message to resonate today with a population that is totally isolated from nature is really a challenge. And that's what we're trying to do with Kiesha's Preserve, and to an extent Yellowstone to Uintas connection. But with Kiesha's Preserve, we're actually bringing kids, families, and others to camp there, to take part in our programs, and to feel the land, wade in the creek, see the beaver dams, that sort of thing, to get that connection. And so while I have friends that advocate for wilderness, and I do too, the reality is we've got to find a message that resonates with people. And I'm concerned that we haven't found that message yet, and I don't know whether there is a message that can actually penetrate the fog that we now live in, the streaming world, the social media world, a world where it's like the most important thing is to get the next video game before your friends do, or, you see the TV commercials, you see the stuff that's on these streaming platforms, the movies, the commercials, they're all depict a life that's like, is this real? Is this real? And so what I try to do and what we try to do is focus locally, try to give experiences, educate people about the value of nature, and then put our information out there so that one day, perhaps when we're a more enlightened society, these facts that we know today that may have disappeared in the future world of libraries and internet could be useful to a future society that might have the motivation to do something. So to answer your question, I don't have an answer for how best to protect wilderness. I just want it to be protected and expanded.
Fair enough. So I'm going to shift gears because we're already halfway through the interview, and I still have a ton of questions that I want to hear from you. So let me ask you this one. Have you thought about how much of the surface of the earth should be wilderness, or even within the lower 48 states? How much should be wilderness in your opinion?
Well, let me deflect a little and reflect on the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the National Forest Management Act, which were implemented circa 1976. And in those acts, there are principles of multiple use and sustained yield. And there are regulatory requirements for preventing degradation, for balancing uses, and for using the best available science. And so it's always been my view that if we had just enforced the intent of our regulations, we wouldn't be where we are today. We wouldn't really necessarily need huge swaths of wilderness to just keep humans at bay. We would be operating in a system where natural ecosystems functioned naturally, where they were driven by the factors that drive ecosystems, not by humans superimposing levels of stress that break those bounds and cause the ecosystem to break down. Like I was mentioning about the protecting of streams, the livestock industry, cattle, will stay in streams. That's their preference. That's their evolutionary history. And yet we have these agencies that invent these monitoring protocols that they can satisfy the green line sedge stubble height, which is a grass-like plant that cows sometimes will eat, mostly after everything else that's palatable has been eaten. And so they can say, well, this stream's meeting our standard, and yet the stream is a hollowed out shell of what a stream should actually look like, and it's polluted and that sort of thing. And so my view has always been, if we can just get these agencies to follow their own regulations, the science, then we have hundreds of millions of acres of lands that are near pristine, that have the complement of species, the birds, the animals, the fish, the salamanders, the frogs, the bears, the lynx. And we're there, and we're operating there, but we're operating at a level that's tolerable to a natural system. We're not doing that.
Yeah. Well,
and so while I would like to see the public lands all be wilderness, I mean, that would be my preference. So you park your car here and you got to walk, I mean, that's what I've done all my life. And so that would be my ideal. I just don't see those protections coming along at any accelerated rate these days. I mean, we had a big pulse of that years gone by. And like George Worther mentioned, there's the national monument scene, like Grand Staircase and Bears Ears, and they're just like political footballs these days. But yes, that I don't know if I've touched on your question or answered it or what, but
yes, you have.
It's a rambling
it's an answer I don't hear very often. It's one worth thinking about, that if these agencies would just follow the original intent of the law, we wouldn't be in the position we're in right now. So
that's pretty much it.
In one of your, I want to go back to something you already mentioned, because I have a question for you, and this is a difficult question. I'm going to ask it anyhow. You lament TV commercials emphasizing conquering the backcountry and off-roading with snowmobiles, ATVs, dirt bikes, pickup trucks, and so on. Would you be in favor of banning or regulating such commercials for the sake of non-human lives on Earth?
Absolutely. The visuals you see on television, the ATV speeding through a stream, the SUV or the pickup truck parked on the top of a pristine mountain or by a pristine lake. Paint a vision of, if you've got one of these, you can experience all this. And what we see, and we see it at Kiesha Preserve, people come up out of Utah, Salt Lake City, into the Bear Lake Valley, and there'll be like 10,000 people around Bear Lake. And there's places they can rent ATVs, UTVs, snowmobiles, and they then flood out across the landscape. But they're in a machine. They're disconnected from nature. They're not having a nature experience. They're not connected. They're apart. And what we see is hundreds of vehicles a day, noise levels that are insane. I mean, 100 decibels is almost like an airport. Nobody enforces any noise regulations. Nobody inspects these things to see if the drivers are underage. You can't get local law enforcement because they're all tied up down at the beaches on Bear Lake, and so the flood of these people has overloaded local law enforcement. And so there's no enforcement of these off-road vehicles, and they know it. And like in the Caribou National Forest, it's like all these dispersed campsites and other forests. There's all these illegally created roads and trails that just expand the road network, and it's a network that's already super dense compared to what wildlife species like grizzly bears or elk or Canada lynx need. And so I don't see a positive outcome here. I don't see where these machines actually are helping to promote nature. It's just more of the life as a party syndrome we seem to be suffering from in today's world, where everything is fun and it's diversion, not attention. And so I would like to see these things regulated. I'd like to see road densities reduced and shut down. And one of the reasons we oppose and litigate timber projects is because of the roads that they continually bring into these areas, and that just further fragments habitats. It brings more people into these areas that might otherwise be a security habitat for an elk, and so it's just a growing problem that I see no end to at this point in time until we have some self-discipline in our society.
I agree 100% with what you just said. Unlike the wolf, the mountain lion, and the grizzly bear, I don't think people fear the lynx very much. And yet there is little compassion for it. How would you explain this?
Well, I guess it's just lack of familiarity. I mean, they're very scarce, and people don't see them. I don't see them. I want to see them. I live where they should be, and yet we do see tracks. And so if you never see something, how can you really care about it? You know what I mean? It's like it's not familiar to people. And so it may be a difficult species to generate support for, but I like to tie it to these other species as well because it's part of the system, part of a, well, I don't know what the best term to use is, but it's a group of animals, you know, the predators, the omnivores, the things like grizzly bears, which really are mostly vegetarian, but they are classified a lot of times as predators. They're more charismatic. You know, people flock to Yellowstone to see them, but they don't flock to Yellowstone to see lynx because you're probably not going to see one. And so it's a difficult thing. And so I rely on the scientific, the ecological needs of the animal to try to protect that habitat for not only it, but the other things that would also protect.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you have been battling agency people for decades. Do you think they are listening to what you say more or less over the last generation?
Well, I can't say that there is a statistically significant change in that ever since I became involved mostly in the grazing issue in the late 80s, it's been pretty much the same story. You know, just deflection and denial and monitoring that makes no sense, that sort of thing. In earlier years, back when they would do forest plans, we would see a lot of back and forth with the forest. These days, it's more like, we're going to come tell you what we're going to do. And you're welcome to show up and look at these displays we have on these tables. But this is not where we're going to comment. You know, it's just for us to give you a one-way set of things that we want you to think or believe and support what we want to do. And here's your options, none of which that are going to protect this forest are we going to adopt. We're going to adopt something that's going to allow us to log and graze and maximize extractive uses as much as possible across the forest. One of the things I've noticed is over time the redefinition of old growth and the Caribou National Forest, where I worked a lot, has been an example of that, where a forest plan would come out and then the definition of old growth would change. All of a sudden it wouldn't need to be a 24-inch diameter tree. It could be a 20-inch or then an 18-inch or then, well, we won't talk about old growth. We're going to talk about mature forest. And so right now the Forest Service, there are people within the agencies that we know that feel the way we do, but they are suppressed from above, from the political machine. And even district rangers that I know have said the regional office won't allow us to address livestock grazing. And so it's like basically a hands-off topic. And so what is a Forest Service employee that wants wildlife or wants healthy vegetation communities to do to keep their job. They try to write these documents, but they're basically told what to write, and so you end up with these environmental analyses that are really Orwellian, where, what can I say? Forest health means a forest's been manipulated out of its natural ecological balance, or restoration is destruction. I mean, it's like Orwell, if he was alive today, could write a book about the Forest Service. Mm-hmm. And so
you mentioned...
that's pretty much it.
Yeah, you mentioned regulatory capture as a big reason for the crisis itself. So this is a big question. I'm not looking for an answer. Maybe you could make a few comments. Is this problem of regulatory capture inseparable from capitalism?
Well, as you've been writing about a new vision, I don't see how that's possible. I mean, we tried to have balance decades ago after Earth Day, and yet it seems that no matter what laws are written, the corporate entities, particularly the people with money, have the ability to fund lobbyists in Washington and in state houses to do quid pro quos with agencies, and essentially you end up with an agency that is subservient to the industries, because the industries have worked through Congress and done other things through the government to weaken the positions of the agencies, and so the agencies then become unwitting tools of the industry. I know that there's a lot of people in the agencies that support the industries. They've come up in it, particularly ranchers. A lot of kids that grew up on ranches go into range science, and so they go to the range science schools like Utah State and others. And in those schools today, they're not being taught the classical range science that provides limits on things. Like you can't go in and graze everything that's there, but yet that's what's happening when Jonathan Ratner or I go out and we monitor how much use is happening on the public lands. It's like in streamside areas, it's nearly everything is eaten. In upland areas, it's like 75%. When the agency does monitoring, they find 10% use, and so everything's fine. So capitalism, I think by its very nature, is controlling, and I think until we have a reset and we have a situation where Congress actually has to act on behalf of the people and not the corporations, it will stay the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thanks for your comments on a very big issue. I ask all my guests this question. Can you tell me in 1 or 2 sentences why wilderness?
Why wilderness? Well, it's at this point in time probably our best protection for natural ecosystems, and we need those as references and examples going forward into the future.
Now, on a more personal level, what do you find in wilderness that you value so much and that you cannot find elsewhere?
Connection to nature, spiritual values. I grew up in the Methodist and Baptist churches in the mountains of North Carolina, where there was a lot of revivals and religious fervor, and that stayed with me for a while. But it was only through my experience being in nature that I felt whole. And when I go out into the wilderness, I prefer to go by myself, because if you have one other person with you, then it's conversation, and you're all of a sudden in a bubble surrounding the two people, and you're not in the wilderness. And so I always recommend, if possible, go by yourself. I've found some wonderful things, just myself and my pack dogs in the Uintas, being away from the trails, being in the desert, climbing the buttes and the canyons. It's just that connection. You feel at home. I don't feel at home anywhere else. I mean, I'm at home in this old log cabin here in Bondurant, Wyoming, and it's an interesting area that burned in a major forest fire 8 years ago. But even still, I look out at the mountains, and I long to be there, not here. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I would say it's a spiritual thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Jonathan Ratner said something similar regarding solitude in the wilderness as being an essential part of a true wilderness experience. So the next question you may have already answered, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. When you look back on your long life, which is actually not that long compared to David Attenborough, who will turn 100 this Friday, would you say that wilderness experiences in the high Uinta wilderness, for example, are among the most memorable and enjoyable times in your life, perhaps unsurpassed by anything, including family and friends?
I would say two things. First, my experience as a child with my grandfather and nature and spending time in the wilderness with him. And it's hard to pinpoint a single time, but there was a time in 1972 when I had abandoned life in Atlanta and, being a contractor and engineer, and gave that up to move west. And first backpacked into the Wind River Mountains, up Boulder Creek, cross country over to what was then known as Middle Fork Lake. And when we came out of the trees and you could see the Continental Divide, it was just so impressive. Mm-hmm. I almost tear up thinking about it, how precious these places are.
What is an effective path for others to feel this kind of love and for others to come to a greater awareness of the value of wilderness and wildlife?
I think it starts particularly with children. I think working at the community level, getting people acquainted with everything from like our gardening classes. Jason's teaching those, and it's like teaching about plant biology and physiology and teaching about what you need for a healthy soil. And so letting the kids get their hands dirty and learning about just the simplest things on the ground, seeing things. There's a concept in Zen called seeing, which we could talk about Carlos Castaneda at another time. Mm-hmm. But
I remember
it's a way of knowledge that you actually see. You're driving down a highway and you see the telephone poles or the power poles, and you don't just see the power poles. You see the power plants, the coal mines, the forests destroyed. It would be deep ecology. It's, natural history. It's all those things combined. But giving people, just even if it's in their own backyard, a nature experience, I think is key. And I would sum up with what naturalist John Burroughs, he said something to the effect that I will let my friends travel the world, and I will stay in my backyard and let the world come to me. And that's the way it is with me. I live here in a recently burned forest. We have a preserve in sage steppe and mountain habitat in southeast Idaho. And those are like Walden was to Thoreau to me. It's like I'm out looking at this place several times a day, watching the plants grow. And so I would like for other people that live in these places to get out and walk around and see what's actually happening on the ground. and that's the way to become connected.
You to put on your scientific cap for this next question. Is there any way of knowing, or maybe crudely estimating, how large a wilderness area would have to be to support a viable population of lynx? Before you answer that question, let me just say that I interviewed Dave Parsons about 6 months ago, and I asked him this question concerning Mexican wolves. And he said that there is no singular answer to my question, but assuming that around 750 wolves for the Southwest is the right number for a viable population, Dave estimated that 37,500,000 acres of suitable habitat is required for the long-term survival of wolves in the Southwest. What would you estimate for the lynx?
Well, let's segregate the lynx populations in the Rocky Mountains to the northern to the Southern Rockies from, Minnesota, Maine, northern Washington areas, because the Minnesota, Maine, and northern Washington populations and northern Idaho populations are actually just extensions of the Canadian populations. And so then you get down to these national forests and the habitat models that particularly Olson and Squires have published, and they provided me with those models, which are basically pixelated images with categories of habitat ranging from 1 to 3, 3 being the most highly suitable habitat, and 1 more or less not pure lynx habitat, but possibly connecting habitats. And then you start looking at the area where lynx might occur, and I can't give you an exact acreage, but there are numerous national forests and connecting BLM lands between them that would comprise tens of millions of acres, is about what I could put on it. You take the Bridger Teton National Forest, for example. It's 3 million acres. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sitting here looking at a map of the Bridger Teton from the Olson model, and in my report, I've got all the acreages and statistics of what's the best and what's the average and what's this and that and the other. But it shows that roughly, 2/3 or 3/4 of that forest is suitable to highly suitable habitats. That would be 2 million acres. Mm-hmm. And then you move north into Yellowstone. Well, Yellowstone itself is 2 million acres. Not all of that is, of course, forested habitat or necessarily lynx habitat. And then you move north into Montana. You got the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest and the Flathead National Forest and the Kootenai and others that each one of which has a significant amount of lynx habitat by the Olson models. And so that leads me to say, tens of millions of acres. And that wouldn't encompass all of these national forests. It would be a significant amount of them.
Okay. So, Joe, just very, very generally speaking, Dave said 37 million for 750 wolves to sustain a viable population. And so you're saying tens of millions, and then just give me a figure to sustain what number of lynx for a viable population.
Well, for example, in the lynx recovery plan, where they have minimized the amount of lynx habitat present in the Greater Yellowstone area, they said, well, if the habitat is managed for lynx, then it could support a population of about 25. And so if you extrapolated that to the area there, you're like talking maybe a few hundred.
Okay.
Glacier National Park, there was a study in Glacier using trail cameras. They documented a population of at least 53 lynx that they were able to identify the individuals through trail cameras. Mm-hmm. And so whatever the size of Glacier is, it supports that many lynx. Mm-hmm. And so you're talking about dozens of lynx maybe in each of these multi-million acre areas. No specific target, but there has to be enough lynx present to sustain the mortality that comes with living in a harsh environment, trying to cross inhospitable areas. And that's one of the factors, is that if we don't have protected connections, the lynx mortality in crossing from one suitable habitat area to the other is fairly high. And so it's, it's like, how many does it need for you to support losing this many each year? It's like a question that's difficult to pinpoint. And I like to focus on, hey, if you're using this model, then it says these acres should be lynx habitat and should be protected as lynx habitat. And so that's the way we approach it. We don't have specific numbers in mind.
Okay. So Dave said that wolves are not picky about the protected status of their habitat. Are lynx more of a wilderness-dependent species than wolves?
I don't know if I know an answer to that, but I would say they're very elusive and secretive animals, and so you're not likely to see one. And so, yes, I would say they're probably a little less, how can I say, they're not a pack animal, and so they're not operating in the security of a pack. And so the males tend to wander, and the females have a fairly large home range, and yet they still need to be secluded. And so they're just not readily visible humans, and they avoid human contact. And so, I would say wolves probably avoid human contact too, but they're forced into it by the way their very nature, as predators.
Okay. So George Werthner, who I interviewed, I think about a month ago, he thinks that more wilderness designation, and I agree with him about this, is still the best strategy for securing biodiversity. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, there's what's known as the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which has been introduced into Congress a number of times, and it mostly covers these forests we're talking about in this regionally significant wildlife corridor. I think it's about 23 million acres in forests in Montana and maybe Idaho and some in Wyoming. I have to go back and look at my mapping to see what the possible extent is. And there is some talk about expanding that footprint. But in any event, that is one mechanism that's been up before Congress and getting more and more sponsors. I don't know what messaging it's going to take to actually get that to have legs, but that's the one that I think is most active now. There are some smaller things happening, like in the Hoosier National Forest in Indiana. There's the Indiana Forest. There's some really interesting goings-on in places you wouldn't think, where protection has got a high level of visibility and local people are making a difference in getting some places protected. Some of the forest types that I grew up with in North Carolina also occur in Indiana and Ohio, and the big, tall, deciduous trees, that sort of thing that we don't have so much of here. We have mostly conifers and aspen.
Mm-hmm. So the push today seems to be toward alternative land protection forms. other than wilderness designation. How do you feel about this shift?
Well, it's I don't want to say it's a terribly bad thing, but I think it's a symptom of people struggling to find a way. And so, people will explore all different alternatives. How can we protect an area? Do we protect it by giving up 2/3 of it so then people can run around on ATVs and dirt bikes? Or do we hold strong and engender local community support to protect their watershed and protect these places that are special to the people that live there? There's a lot of people living in these rural communities in the Intermountain West and in the Rockies that grew up there and that treasure the landscape they grew up in. And they, a lot of times, have been the advocates for protecting places. I remember when I lived in Minden, Utah, there's a mountain range there called the Wellsville Mountains. And in the 1930s, that place was devastated by sheep and the timber had been cut. And there was a local guy from a nearby community, John Stewart, I think was his name. Yeah, John Stewart. And he pointed all this damage out to the people in the area, and they got the sheep off of the mountains because they knew it was damaging their watersheds. Well, then come along, and I don't remember the exact time period, but there was a wilderness proposal for the Wellsville Wilderness, 25,000 acres in this mountain range. It's one of the steepest in the country, and I used to hike to the top for exercise and loved it. Beautiful trail along the crest, views out across the Great Basin. Anyway, this issue came up in one of the wilderness battles to get places designated, and the Wellsville Mountains was one of those wilderness areas. And so at that point in time, I went to the city councils in both towns, Minden and Wellsville, and they passed resolutions in support of wilderness. One of them later recanted, but then their support had been registered, and it was a demonstration that local communities, when provided a perspective on the connection between them and their surroundings, can support these things. Here in Sublette County, we see local people rising up against billionaire developments that want to develop our wild areas or put subdivisions in wildlife migration corridors. And so the local people are showing up in large numbers at town meetings to oppose these things. And so I still think that we can get wilderness areas and protected areas, wildlife corridors, with the support of local people. And in fact, Colorado College does polls on environment in the West, and they point out how the majority of people support these things. And in fact, here in Sublette County, which is an oil and gas county, a lot of our infrastructure is paid for by oil and gas revenues. The people they don't want, public lands sold off for oil and gas. They want those lands protected over and above oil and gas. And so while some development is okay, wholesale development is not with the locals. And so I still think messaging locally is a powerful tool, and we need to take more advantage of it.
Okay, well, it's a big issue, and it's a controversial issue, but thanks for putting it out there. So do you think environmentalists should get the best possible deal for the nation's wilderness study areas and roadless areas right now? Or do you think we should hold out for wilderness designation?
Well, when you talk about deal making, you're talking about collaboration and compromise. And I think some of your past guests have pointed out, the art of negotiation. You don't start out in a compromised position, because then you compromise from that compromise and end up with maybe a quarter of what you started out with.
Right. Both Howie and George were very emphatic about that. So
yeah, and I've been guilty of collaborating in the sense of trying to get better monitoring and and working with ranchers and that sort of thing. We work with the local farming community at Kiesha Preserve. And so I think that we need to hold out while the wilderness study areas and inventory roadless areas are there. We should hold on to those and not give them up. I mean, I see them being given up for, say, phosphate mines in southeast Idaho needs 1,000 acres for a tailings pond or something like that. And so they'll do a land swap. But I think we need to hold on to them and get wilderness wherever we can, when we can, for as long as it takes.
Okay. Why have you focused on the lynx? Is it because it's an umbrella species? Are there other reasons for why you have focused on the lynx?
Well, I used to have house cats, and when I was living on the farm with my grandfather, we had 17 cats. And at that time, Richard Nixon and Eisenhower were in office. I had two of them that were Persian blue colored cats, and I named them Ike and Nick. And so I've always kind of liked cats, and so I guess that there's something about their independence that is attractive. And so because the lynx was the species of interest in southeast Idaho with the phosphate mines, the fact that it used to occur there and didn't any longer really is what brought it to my attention. It wasn't because of my love of cats particularly or anything like that. It was just that they were the species that was being most hindered. Now, there used to be grizzly bears in these areas, the Bear River Range and down into Utah, and that is a further reach than a Canada lynx as far as advocating. I mean, I do advocate for it, but I think Canada lynx is our most proximate species, having occurred in the Uintas and in southeast Idaho in recent times before we invaded the place with too many roads and people and mines and too many logging projects, that sort of thing. Okay. And so those are things that, over time can be restored and provide habitat. And so the lynx is my mechanism for making that argument.
I see. I know that you started your career as an engineer. What brought about your transition to the biological sciences?
Well, when I was living in Atlanta, designing and building mechanical systems for places, it was like you'd go to work in the morning and there'd be an emergency. You might have to fly to Chicago or Boston. And it's like the constant and hectic nature of that whole lifestyle. I mean, I loved going to the football games and all of that and the food and that sort of thing. But around 1970, I realized that I needed to be somewhere else because I would, at every opportunity, escape to the mountains, go up to the Smokies and backpack into the backcountry and fish the streams and fight the no-see-ums in spring and summer and hike the Appalachian Trail. And I was in the Sierra Club at that time even, and also a member of the Appalachian Trail Club. And so I had this connection even then, but something was missing, and I knew that I wasn't destined to live my life in Atlanta, Georgia, because I had watched Atlanta grow from a big town to a sprawl of miles and miles in every direction, invading the landscape as it grew outward. And so having been coming to Utah and Wyoming since the late 50s, early 60s, I knew I wanted to go somewhere like that. And so come 72, I quit my job, did a little consulting on the side, and had bought a Dodge four-wheel drive pickup and put a shell on it and fitted that out with a bunk. And I was headed for northern Canada or Alaska to maybe teach in a native school or something like that. And on my way west, I stopped and visited my folks in Brigham City, and then I went to visit a cousin who taught civil engineering at Utah State University. And Winfred talked me into visiting the biology department. So I went and talked to the people in the biology department. And the next thing you know, I ended up with an assistantship, and I was working on my PhD in ecology. and meeting all these tremendous ecologists like James McMahon and Neil West and Art Holmgren, who wrote the Intermountain Flora, and going on field trips with those people, and just I ended up staying in Utah and started a consulting business to work on oil shale projects in the Vernal and the Uinta Basin. And there we had the opportunity to really get into the nitty-gritty of how ecosystems function. And so the dreams of the far north faded in the love of actually trying to quantify what is the White River ecosystem. How does it function? What about the plant communities and the animals that live here?
The state of Utah and the Utah Division of Wildlife, you probably already know this, but for the sake of the audience, are slaughtering mountain lions using neck snares and bait traps to increase deer populations. Kurt Robinson from Western Wildlife Conservancy is presently bringing together a lot of environmental organizations and other forces to try to stop this slaughter. It's sad what's happening to both the mountain lion and the lynx because it's so unnecessary, and the economic momentum is against it. Can it be stopped, and what will it take to stop it?
Well, I think Kirk is pointing the way with a number of groups there in Utah to show up at the meetings of the Wildlife Board and to oppose this as long as it takes to hopefully get it stopped. It's a very flawed approach. It bears no relationship to reality. I mean, I calculated the deer population and the elk population that could be supported in Utah if we didn't have public lands grazing 30 years ago, and it's like in the hundreds of thousands to millions. So we're talking about killing a few mountain lions. Let's talk about getting the cows out of some of these forests and letting the deer have habitat. That's where the hunters ought to be pointed.
So many environmentalists focus on a reduction in human population, rightly so. Is there a way for science, perhaps using the concept of the carrying capacity of the land, to determine an ideal human population, one that can coexist with biodiversity?
Well, I think there's been attempts at that, and I don't remember the numbers, 150 million, 2 billion, whatever, but as long as we're driven by materialistic goals, the accumulation of material goods and wealth, it is just not, it doesn't seem possible that we can bring this under control short of some sort of upset condition.
Is global warming, with its declining snowpack levels, entailing the decline of the snowshoe hare, making the survival of the lynx unlikely pretty much everywhere?
Well, certainly habitats will diminish in size, but the climate modeling that's been done shows that these areas actually in the Middle Rockies, like here in the Greater Yellowstone and in the Colorado area, will retain their snow cover the longest. And so there are these climate refuges that we have, which unfortunately the agencies have not deemed worthy of protection. It's very short-sighted.
I've heard it said that polar bears and wolverines are likely to go extinct. Is this true for the lynx?
Well, I mean, certainly it's true for most species. I mean, many species that were here before aren't here now, and so inevitably at some point in time that's probably true, but we operate within spans of years that we can somehow visualize, and so they shouldn't go extinct in the near future. I would say we're good for 100 years or two, but who knows what tipping points we're going to hit on climate in the very near future here. So we just have to wait and see.
It seems to me that many, many Americans never think about the lynx. They never wonder what it's doing and how it's doing. I'm not sure that scientific arguments concerning the lynx move them very much. Your response?
Well, it's true. I mean, environmental organizations rely a lot on highly visible species like grizzly bears or like elk as objects representing these wild areas that they would like to see protected. And so the Canada lynx is a little less charismatic, I guess, as opposed to a wolf in Yellowstone or a grizzly bear in Yellowstone. And so, but it has a cuteness factor, like pygmy rabbits are cute, and they're threatened, and their habitat's being lost. And so I think maybe showing lynx to kids and getting them into their memory a bit might help, but it's a far reach.
I've never seen a lynx, but I did see a bobcat several months ago walking across an agricultural field in broad daylight, and I felt it was risking its life to do so. I've reached a point where I don't like to see predators outside of protected wilderness areas. Do you share this concern?
Oh yeah, we have a terrible situation with mountain lions at Kiesha Preserve. There's local guides there that just flood the area with hounds and snowmobiles in the winter, hunting down and killing mountain lions. Then they're complaining about there's no mountain lions, and so we have seen mountain lions on the preserve. I even had one in my front yard with 6 cicadas looking on here in 2014, and I think the dogs were so shocked at this big cat, they just laid there and watched it float across the snow into the trees. But in any event, yes, I share your concern. I live in an area where people say, oh, the coyotes are becoming aggressive. Oh, there's a wolf. And somebody else will say, well, do you want me to come shoot it? And I'm just appalled. It's like I live in their home, and I make everything that I do is designed to accommodate all the wild animals that live here and should live here. And so being as unobtrusive as possible is the end goal.
Well, I certainly agree with that. Wilderness is the home of wild animals, and we need a lot more of it. Do you think the general population is beginning to feel this way, or maybe not?
I don't have a clue. I kind of think not, but then I'll see a glimmer of hope. But the pace of change is so rapid, and the evolution of technology and people's attention spans are so distracted. If people are becoming more aware, it's an extreme small minority.
Did you know that Thoreau mentions the lynx in his book, The Maine Woods, which was published in 1864? I'll read you this quick statement that he makes. The Canadian lynx is sometimes found here. If you look at the larger context of the paragraph, he treats the lynx as a sign of wildness, a presence known more by rumor than anything else. I think you alluded to this point earlier, but could it be that the lynx is the wild animal that no one knew about if it was to go extinct?
Well, most people might not know about it, but there would be a few of us that do, and I like that passage from Thoreau. I read a lot of his work decades ago, and that brings back a memory to me. So, yes, I think it would be missed, but not by most people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to read the next sentence to you, but basically already pointed it out. But the sentence is that there are a few people who know about not only knew about Glen Canyon before it was dammed, but also know about the lynx, and one of those people would be you. You must feel a tremendous responsibility to save the lynx. Can you describe this feeling?
Well, it's not I made a choice a few months ago to do what is recommended, and that's to work on the things that you can control. And so it narrows my focus. I'm able to put out of my mind what's going on in the world. It's an abstraction, a soap opera. It has real consequences. But in terms of my work, I get great satisfaction out of analyzing the situations, analyzing the data, using the agency's own information and confronting them. And so it's a joy, and it is a duty in some way because I'm compelled to do it, but it's a pleasant duty.
Okay, we only have time for one more question, so I'm looking here to see what that should be.
When is the world going to end?
That would be a good one.
Let's talk about GDP.
If you want to why don't I just let you make the last statement in the last 2 minutes we have? So take it away.
Well, I did get an MBA in finance while I was living in Atlanta, and so I've been very aware of business cycles and economics over the years. And there were books published in the 70s. One was called Steady State Economics. And as I've looked at the situation and the way our economy is driven by growth, you know, as a population ecologist, there's a familiar curve known as the logistic curve. It's an S-shaped curve. It starts out with a lag phase, and then when resources are perceived unlimiting, then it goes to an exponential increase, and all of a sudden resources become limiting, and then it crashes. And so we're in this cycle of ever-increasing growth, now with AI, and we're already over-consuming the resources of the earth, and so we're propped up in this house of cards. And so our GDP is growing every year, as is our national debt, as is interest rates, and people are no longer worshiping the dollar, and so countries are moving away from the dollar. And so one day, interest rates are going to rise out of control, the dollar will lose its value, and then the economy is going to come crashing down. And then what are people going to say about a capitalist system that didn't deliver? And maybe there will be a return to a more conservative lifestyle where conservation is actually part of the equation, which it is not now.
Well said. Thanks, John, for the interview. You are one of the most important voices for the lynx in America, and I can hardly think of a more essential calling for a scientist. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 Radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversation in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number.